Um, so all of that said, I'm trying to just get all these various windows closed. So all of that said, Proverbs chapter 5, 6, and 7 all deal with the same basic concepts, which is to say that Solomon uses Proverbs 5, 6, and 7 to hit as close to the home as is possible. So he's going to deal with the intimate relationship between husband and wife, which is where we are today. He's going to deal with the questions that come with that: marital fidelity, relationships outside the marriage, relationships before the marriage, specifically physical relationships. In chapter 6, he deals with economics. He talks about money, to be honest with you, and how money should work. What is it, the phrase, a borrower and a lender never be, that kind of thing. So we are here, Proverbs chapter 5. It doesn't have us doing the whole thing for reasons I'm not 100% sure on, but we're going to just roll from verse 3 to verse 18, which omits the introduction and omits the conclusion. So basically the good parts. So Proverbs chapter 5, you can really divide it into 3 sections. It's how he structures most of these chapters. So just, we all recognize when I say immorality, what I mean are physical relationships outside of the marital union, whether they are infidelity based, whether it is pre-marriage, whatever the case may be. That's what the term is going to be used for purposes of our conversation today. So in verses 1 through 6, Solomon advises his son, and by extension, as we've discussed, God is advising us as people living in a world that is saturated with sensuality and immediate physical gratification, that immorality on a physical level, because that's where we are today, is an illusion, that it's short-term thinking, long-term detriment. So that's verses 1 through 6. Verses 7 through 14, Solomon rolls from the illusion, what I've called the sleight of hand, to what the implication of giving into that magic trick is, the detriment that it plays to the individual and to those around them. And then finally, in verses 15 through 23, having given us the negative, or the con, Solomon flips the script and he says, now, I'm not telling you that you ought not have intimate relationships with someone. I'm just saying it should be within the confines of a marriage that is based on a God-given love. So 1 through 14 outline the problem. 15 through 23 outline what I guess you could say is this God's solution to that issue, God's path of dealing with it. So if you think of it that way, it flows a little bit easier. Now, you'll notice that I've left in the top right-hand corner the section we're in. So this is the illusion of immorality. And I just think of this as Solomon saying, look, here's the magic trick that the world wants to run on you. So verse 3 begins by telling us, though the lips of the forbidden woman drip honey and her words are smoother than oil, in the end, she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. So verse 3 is our setting, and it's actually the setting and the deception all in one. We're dealing in chapter 5 with what Solomon refers to as the forbidden woman. Now, he deals with this concept throughout the book of Proverbs. He actually deals with it a lot in the book of Song of Solomon, which we're going to do next. It's replete in Psalm as well. But I want to stop at that phrase, the forbidden woman, and kind of make a few things, crystallize a few concepts before we move into the substance. So first, it does not necessarily mean forbidden in the traditional sense that it can. The other woman is actually what it's literally translated into. But this is not Solomon just saying to men or to young men in this case, or married men, that this is a problem. Just remember that the literary device that Solomon used to articulate his advice in the book of Proverbs is always a son being guided by his father. So I say that to come to this conclusion. We could just as easily flip the script and say, though the lips of the other man drip honey, and his words are smoother than oil. It's not the person. It's not the gender. It could actually be expanded further beyond that, in my mind, because really what he's getting at is what he's really getting at is it's someone that's outside the marital relationship. So her lips drip honey, her words are smoother than oil. So that's kind of where we are in what she does. Now, this is the trick, right? It's talking about the short-term in. So the short-term illusion that's offered by a relationship with someone that is the other person, whether it's someone who's not your wife, someone who's not your husband, someone to whom you're not married yet in the premarital context, is that relationship and that person will be characterized by sweet words, the words drip honey, and quick answers. So, we take a step back and we ask, well, what does that mean? Well, in the marital context, sometimes answers are not quick and answers are not easy. And any of us who have been married have had the conversations that are hard. The dialogue sometimes is difficult because life happens. So Solomon is saying that may be how it is with your spouse. And that's the allure that this other person offers sometimes, is there's comfort where in a marriage there's tension, there's ease where in a marriage there's inertia or friction. And the words are sweeter, there's flattery involved. However, says Solomon, in the end, she's as bitter as wormwood and as sharp as a double-edged sword. So the short-term illusion of immorality, physical relationships outside of the marital context, is it offers short-term enjoyment, short-term affirmation, short-term pleasure. The long-term reality, bitter as wormwood, is just poisonous anguish. Wormwood was a weed or an herb that it's all throughout the Bible, but its taste is bitter. That's why it's called. That's why they say it that way. It's bitter. It sits on the tongue, and the longer it sits on the tongue, the more it anguishes your mouth. So, although the short-term words are sweet, the long-term impact of succumbing to those words is poisonous. Now, sharp is a double-edged sword. We know that phrase from other contexts in the Bible. So, for example, Paul describes the sword of the Spirit as being a double-edged sword. The difference between a one-edged sword and a double-edged sword is that a single-edged blade was just meant to slash. It was meant to only harm one direction. A double-edged sword, by its nature, cuts every way you swing it. And so Solomon is saying, the other woman, the other man, the other person, this other relationship that is outside of God's will for the individual is lethally dangerous. You're not talking about a paper cut. You're talking about something that will cut to the very heart of you as a person. So you could really blow back the whole way and look at it this way. Solomon begins his discussion with his son about the physical and intimate relationship between husband and wife by starting with the negative and saying, and Nicole hates when I use this analogy, but he's telling his son that it's chess, not checkers. You can't look one move ahead. What's gonna give me some positive endorphin rush today? What's gonna make me feel like more of a man today? What is gonna make me feel loved today? Because that short-term illusion eventually fades to the long-term reality that the words are empty, that the harm cuts both ways, and it will all fall apart. I think Solomon would agree with putting it this way. Immorality, as it relates to physical relationships, is always going to be a house of cards. It seems stable, it's diverting to build, but when it all comes down, it doesn't just waffle, it crashes. And that's kind of the message he's trying to build to as he starts us off, not gradually, but immediately, by telling us about the other woman in verses 3 and 4. Now, I do want to make one point that deals with the antecedents of each verse, though and in the end. And really the issue to me here is verse 3 is saying though. That is Solomon telling us. That is Solomon telling his son what all of us have or will ultimately tell our children. There is no denying the allure of physical intimacy. He is saying that is a factual matter. The words that someone that's trying to seduce you utters will be sweet. They will come smoothly. They will promise quick return and positive pleasure. He's not denying the facts. What he's saying is, in the end, so again, he's saying there's today and then there's the rest of your life. So in no way, shape, or form is Solomon moralizing here, in the sense that he's not saying that we should deny the danger. In fact, he's acknowledging the danger that we all struggle with in this area outright, by saying we have to acknowledge the hazard to avoid it. If you're playing golf, for example, I don't play golf, so I'm going to torture this analogy. You have to know where the rough is. You have to know where the sand traps are, so as not to hit your ball into them. You have to know the danger. And so Solomon in verse 3 gives us the illusion, and in verse 4, he blows it away and says, no, think long term, always think long term. And the long term has to do with the hidden destination of extramarital intimacy. It's the short term versus the long term is the hidden destination. So in verse 5, he says, her feet go down to death, her steps straight for Sheol. Now, I think that this one, we know who her is, the other woman. It could just as easily be he, the other man, if you're a woman. It could just as easily be the promise of adult material that you would find on the internet or on HBO or on the rack at a newsstand, right? If they even still do that. Her feet here just refers to the extramarital intimacy outside of the marriage. Says goes down to death and heads straight for Sheol. I propose that you look at this two ways, because Solomon's covering both ends of the spectrum. First, he's saying her feet go down to death. Here he's talking about physical death, so the body. And the reason I think that is in Job 7, and this is throughout the Bible, this is just the best verse for it. Job says, when I say my bed will comfort me and my couch will ease my complaint, this is Job talking to God, by the way, then you frighten me with dreams and you terrify me with visions, so that I prefer strangling, death rather than life in this body. So remember, what Job is going through is he has become the focal point of a diametric competition that the devil's pitching, that God says you can do what you want, but I'm going to win. And as the burdens of life mount, as the curse of the devil mounts, as his children are struck dead, as his body is ravaged by disease, as his friends turn on him, Job says, I can't rest. I can't see clearly. I live a life of terror. I would rather die than live this way anymore, God. Just take me, very much like Elijah. So her feet go down to death. Solomon is saying, pursuing intimacy outside of the God-given construct of marriage will inevitably lead you to a place of physical death. Now, this could refer to the obvious of venereal diseases or things of that nature, and I'm not denying that. But I think what Solomon is also getting to is that you can only commit yourself to so many relationships and juggle so many relationships before it just becomes too much, and holding all of that together, keeping the illusion intact, if you will, you lose the ability to even rest. And that slowly erodes your ability to find peace and tranquility. And if you live a life where you never know peace or tranquility, the inevitable outcome is there is only one real way to find rest. So I don't think we're being melodramatic. I just think Solomon is saying, if you make a series of choices in this way that are wrong, you are eroding your mental health. Your physical health will follow or accompany it, and the consequences are undeniable. But more important is the second clause. Her steps head straight for Sheol. Now, Sheol in the Old Testament, of course, is the Old Testament word for what we would call hell, for what Paul always calls hell, the weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's spiritual death. So the short-term illusion of pleasure in an immoral relationship will lead to the long-term reality of not just physical decline, but also spiritual death. And this is just a logical point, right? You cannot disregard God's design for physical relationships as occurring within the context of marriage and marriage only, and not suffer spiritually. And so when we use the word spiritual death, I want to prove why we're calling it that. This is also from Job chapter 7. As a cloud fades away and vanishes, so the one who goes down to Sheol will never rise again. So Job is saying, once you descend into spiritual death, you can't come back from that. This is a New Testament concept as well. We in the book of Romans, we talked about how eventually God gives them over and they become so deluded by their immorality that they don't even think it's immoral, and they encourage people to continue doing it. That's spiritual death. Apathy. The word in the New Testament is to sear the conscience such that it doesn't even bother you anymore. And certainly the truth of immoral physical relationships, whether it be with a person or with viewing things, watching things, particularly in the age of the internet, is that the chemical reaction speaks for itself. It takes more and more to give you the same amount of return, and it will and it's because you're becoming accustomed to it. It leads to needing more and more and more. It's just like a drug. Dopamine's a reaction. And so choosing to disregard God's design doesn't just hurt you physically and emotionally and mentally. It also hurts you spiritually, says Solomon. Now, I think that phrase "head straight there" is interesting. To me, I always think of community chest, right? Go to jail, go directly to jail, don't pass go, don't collect 200. Because as anybody that has had the misfortune of being in a marriage that has experienced this can tell you, when the bottom crashes out, it crashes quick, right? When you walk down the road with the other woman or the other man or the other person, when the end comes, it comes quick, because you get your comeuppance very quickly. And so Solomon says she goes down physically, she will deteriorate you, but when death comes, it will be instant. There will be no avoiding it. And the Bible is replete with instances of that, as we'll see in a minute. In verse 6, we see why that's possible. So kind of take a step back in verse 6. Solomon has told his son, don't take the short-term road, look at the long-term game. And if you do that, you'll see that choosing the other person, choosing to go outside of the marriage for physical satisfaction and intimacy, will lead you to physical decay and spiritual death. The question becomes, well, then why would anyone do that? Why? Think of this from a child's perspective. Why would I do that? That just seems like it's not worth it. Solomon now is going to explain why this other person is doing what they do. She doesn't consider the path of life. She doesn't know her ways are unstable. Again, she, the other person. So path of life, I think you go back to Proverbs 4, verse 26 to understand what he's getting at. There, he said, carefully consider the path for your feet, and in all your ways be established. Don't turn to the right or to the left. Keep your feet away from evil. So what is the path of life? The path of life is the straight line path. Remember, it keeps our path straight, pragmatically straight and morally straight, as we've talked about for 2 or 3 weeks now. You don't turn to the left. You don't turn to the right. Last week, we talked about how that meant when you saw evil, you go the other way. You don't flirt with it. You don't engage with it. You don't long for it. You just keep your feet away from evil. So Solomon is saying a person who tries to pull someone else into an immoral relationship, to pull them away from their marriage, or to pull them away from saving themselves for marriage, even if he's talking to a young person. The reason that the other woman here, the other man, if you will, is doing that is because she or he does not have an appreciation for keeping their feet away from evil. Solomon is basically saying that person's compass is not pointing toward the things of God. It's pointing towards the things of evil. So their compass is off, so their way is off, so they're walking the wrong way. And one thing I think we would all agree is that people that are walking the wrong way in life are seldom happy to walk it by themselves. They would always much rather have you join them all the way to the bitter end. So Solomon says, you have to know what you're dealing with when you're dealing with relationships outside the marriage. They are inevitably pointed not towards salvation, but towards damnation. And what makes it worse is that other person doesn't, what this says, know that her ways are unstable. So I think, and the commentaries kind of agree, this second clause means one of two things. It could be both, but it's one of two. She doesn't know that her ways are unstable. So option number one is what you see now. That means that person, the she, in immorality, the other woman, is unknowingly walking towards destruction. They don't know any better. They are the victim of their own ignorance. And they don't necessarily, she does in this case, and I apologize to all the women. I'm just, using the pronoun. She doesn't realize that premarital intimacy detracts from marital intimacy later. She is not married, or she doesn't have a solid conception of marriage. And so it doesn't bother her that the person she's trying to seduce is married. Her moral framework is different. She just doesn't get it. You would almost call this ignorance as an excuse, I think. I don't think Solomon's using that, though. I know that's part of what some people argue, but I don't think that's right. And here's why. If you think about verses 3, 4, and 5, Solomon is not painting a picture of a temptress or a tempter, the other woman or the other man, who is innocent in ignorance. He's painting a picture of someone that is deliberately trying to entrap you. And so in that sense, I think it's more number two. The other woman or the other man are intentionally leading you toward destruction. Why? Well, because their ways she doesn't consider the path of life, so she doesn't really care about it for you. Or two, she has disregarded God's design for intimacy and has decided that she is going to take anyone she can down with her. Now, again, I'm deeply uncomfortable by this because I recognize that in the world we are in, first of all, it's not always a physical he or she. Certainly it is, but the temptations of the modern world are just as often digital as they are physical. And so I think that Solomon's advice here addresses that, though. I also think we would be foolish and simplistic to take the position that men are always the tempted, and women are always the temptress. Women are always forbidden, and men are being led about by sheep, because that is not at all what the Bible is saying. So just keep in mind that it's interchangeable, and it's meant to accommodate the reality that it doesn't matter what the intimacy is. If it's outside of God's design for marriage, it is not considering the path of life, and it is inherently unstable, which means it will lead to destruction, which is where he's coming to next. Solomon's now going to switch. He's basically outlined the trick. Think only about today. I know she doesn't understand you, but I understand you. Tell me all about it. Or, you need a man who takes care of you the way that I take care of you. You need someone who will give you the nice things that you deserve. And I know your husband's not doing it, but I will. So, just stick with me. He's saying that's the trick. But you can avoid it if you recognize the importance of marital fidelity. Verse 7, so now sons, listen to me and don't turn away from the words of my mouth. We talked about this phrase last week. Listen to me is not just to hear, it is to understand. It's to pay attention. It's to understand. It is listening with the intention of applying. So Solomon here in verse 7 does the same thing he did at the beginning in verse 1. He is pleading with his son to take a step back from the momentary desire, the momentary rush of want, and say, stop, listen, understand, don't turn away. Put what I'm telling you into practice. Listen to me. Trust me. Keep your way far from her. Do not go near her house. And I've subtitled this one, To Flirt or Not to Flirt, because I think what Solomon's getting at is you cannot play with fire without getting burned. You cannot engage in some of the first steps to this type of immoral behavior without eventually, even if it's not with that same person, eroding your conscience enough to where you get to a place that you never thought you'd be. So Solomon's saying here, just walk away from it. Keep your way far from her. Don't go near the door of her house. We know the her could also be the him, but again, this is the modern world. It could also be the it. It could also be whatever it is on the computer or on an iPhone or on TV. He's saying, don't tempt yourself. Don't play with temptation. What is it? Her, the other woman, a foreign woman. We're also going to see it called, which is going to be important in a minute. And then we have this, keeping away from her, don't go near the door. And so I think the question that Solomon wants us to ask here is, okay, what does that mean? Like, how does that work? And so the best place to me to answer a question like that is to look at what the Bible says. 1 Corinthians 6:18a, flee sexual immorality, with an exclamation point. Paul makes it very, very simple. 1 Thessalonians 5:22, stay away from every kind of evil. And when Paul says stay away, it's that verb that means now, tomorrow, the next day, in perpetuity. So we're to flee from it. We're to stay away from it each and every day. This, of course, is also one verse that we've seen before, 1 Thessalonians 4. For this is God's will, your sanctification, that you keep away from immorality, that each of you knows how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not with lustful passions like the Gentiles who don't know God. Paul's argument is simple. We know God wants the sanctification of our physical and intimate lives. That's what he wants. We know this because it goes that way all the way at the beginning. So what separates us from the rest of the world? And we've talked a lot about the different ways we should be characterized by our love and not by our hate, not by our envy, but by our contentment. We should come along other believers. We should love everybody. And that's all true. But in 1 Thessalonians, Paul is making the unwavering argument that another thing that separates the Christian from the world around them is that the Christian is not driven by lustful passions like them, like the rest of the world. If we know God, we have to trust God's design for physical relationships, which is defined in the constraints of a marriage. So says Paul, and you would tell me, well, Austin, you like Paul, and you can see that from here, 1 Corinthians, 1 Thessalonians. So what if Paul's wrong? Okay, I suppose that's so, but Jesus is not wrong. So on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus deals with this very concept. You've heard that it was said, don't commit adultery, quoting the 10 Commandments. But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus goes even further than anyone had before, because Jesus says it's not about the physical action of immorality. It is about the thought. And so the problem is here and here. It's not your body. It's not your actions. So Solomon is really setting the stage for the argument that Jesus drives home in the Sermon on the Mount, that Paul now elaborates on. It's not something you can play with, because if you're playing with it mentally, you've already done it. If you're playing with it in your heart, you've already done it. So how do we do that? We flee, we stay away, we control our bodies, and holiness and in honor, would say the Bible. What happens if we don't? This is the unfortunate reality of it. I think we've all seen people, some of us have been in this situation where this advice is disregarded, where immorality becomes the choice that someone has made, and there are the consequences that come from it. And Solomon pulls no punches on describing the consequence. Verse 9 and 10, otherwise, meaning if you choose to pursue physical relationships outside of the marital context, you will give up your vitality to others and your years to someone cruel. Strangers will drain your resources, and your hard-earned pay will end up in a foreigner's house. Easy to look at this and say, well, we don't really have foreigners' houses. What is he talking about? Well, let's start otherwise. Solomon, Jesus, Paul, David, pick your poison. All of them agree that we're to flee from immorality, right? So when it says otherwise, it doesn't just mean having an improper physical relationship with someone that's not your spouse. It means even going down the road of thinking that way. If you do that, you will give up your vitality to others. Vitality translates alternatively into honor, meaning your ability to be taken seriously and at your word. So you're giving that up. You're giving up your honor. You're giving up your time. And certainly this makes sense. If I had a second wife, I would be giving up the time with my first wife and family to be with her, the other her. And so I'm giving up my honor. I'm not an honorable person if I'm doing that, because I'm not keeping my word. I'm not honoring my vows. I'm giving up my time. I am giving it not just to someone generally, but someone that is cruel, someone that is not actually lovingly caring for me as God designed, but someone that is using me just as much as I'm using them. That will result in a drain of my resources. This does not mean money. This means strength and energy. This means my attention is divided so many different directions that I can't focus on the job that God has given me as a husband, to love my wife and to protect and sacrifice myself for her, just as Christ did the church. My strength and energy are being depleted. It's a bucket with lots of holes in it, and the water is just running out, and you're losing it. And my hard-earned pay, my finances will also be affected, because either it's the cost of trying to keep it all secret, or it's the cost of dealing with the fallout. I mean, one of the things that blew my mind when I became a lawyer and moved to Texas was, in Texas, absent a prenuptial agreement, in a divorce, the wife's legal fees can be paid by the husband. That's very common. And so imagine a scenario where you have this type of immorality, and wife says, I want a divorce, which, by the way, as Baptists, we believe that would be an appropriate divorce. That is a justified divorce, the one there's been infidelity. And wife says, now you're going to pay for my divorce lawyer to sue you for divorce. That is an effect on your hard-earned pay. So Solomon says it's not just a matter of right and wrong. There are very pragmatic effects that it's hard to think about when you're in the throes of that temptation. You lose your word. You're not a person of your word. Your time is divided. You're not getting affection. You're just being used and doing the using. You're giving up your strength and your energy and your money, and you're doing it to others. Look at how he defines them: others, someone, strangers, foreigners. So this is not just Solomon trying to throw a noun in a sentence. He's doing this specifically to cast a light, a cruel and revealing light on this other person, this other woman, this other man, this person on the internet, this website. That's what he's doing. So it could be the outraged spouse, right? Who are you? Look at the someone cruel. You're giving your ears to someone cruel. Strangers will drain you. This could be the effect of dealing with the spouse of the person. It could be your family or your spouse's family as you're having to deal with the fallout of going outside your marital vows. It could be, and this is, of course, Solomon's perspective, but if it's someone who, one of the ways that the marital relationship can be compromised is by exchanging money for the immoral conduct. And so Solomon's saying, in that case, you're basically putting yourself in debt, not just to the woman, but to her pimp. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think of a better way to put it, but I can't. Or, and this is the one I think that he really is kind of sneaky about a little bit, the other people that this woman or this man have had this kind of relationship with. It's one of the things that it's hard to describe when you're having the birds and the bees talk with your children, but you can't separate all of the pieces, And so Solomon, when he talks about the others, he's talking about the other people affected by a relationship outside the marriage. When he talks about the someone, it's the same thing. He's saying it's not just about you and your spouse and this other person. It's everyone affected. Your children, their spouses, their in-laws, your in-laws, their friends, your friends, all of it. Strangers, people you don't even know. I don't think I am over exaggerating Solomon's position if I say that in his mind, your intimate choices and the way that the relationship between husband and wife is treated is like throwing a boulder in the pond, and the ripples just spread and spread and spread and spread. And he's telling his son, you have to think about all of that before you do it and decide you don't want anything to do with it, because don't trust yourself in the moment. Don't trust yourself in that particular point in time. Walk away from it before then, because if you don't, here is what you're risking. Here is what you're giving up. And I mean, you can look at that list and decide which one's more important, right? I mean, I think they're all pretty significant, but in the end, giving up your ability to be a person of honor and of dignity because you were dishonest, that seems to me to be the most significant. Now, if you take 9 and 10 and lump it all together, what Solomon says is when you engage in this type of conduct, when you go outside the marital relationship to seek physical fulfillment, you are choosing, says Solomon. I am choosing, you are choosing, the son is choosing, the daughter is choosing, all of us are choosing to voluntarily put ourselves at someone else's mercy. He's basically saying you're not in control anymore. You're giving the choice away and you're letting someone else make the choice of how your family's going to get through it, how your finances look, how your strength and your time and your love looks. You're taking that and you are handing it to someone else and you don't know what they're going to do with it, says Solomon. We see this. I was trying to think of an example from the Bible. I think that Samson is a great example. We know the story of Samson, Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16. Gifted with extraordinary strength and courage and vitality, but Solomon had a wandering eye. And in his case, the issue was not infidelity in the sense that he was married but went outside his marriage. In his case, it was that he could not contain his lustful passions, to use Paul's language. And what he saw, he had to have. What he saw, he had to have. And in the end, he saw nothing because he lost it all. In Judges 16, it tells us that when he was ultimately captured after his betrayal by Delilah, that the Philistines seized him, they gouged out his eyes, they brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he was forced to grind grain in the prison. Solomon did not, although actually he lost quite a bit. Samson lost everything because really 3 things. 1, he would not discipline himself. 2, he did not control his passions. And 3, Samson, more than any other figure in the Bible, thought that he could play with this part of life and that he could get away with it because he was stronger than everybody else and he was tougher. And so I'm going to mess those up the rest of the day. If Samson could fall, so can any of us. And Samson quite literally lost everything, including his life, because of this sin. This is how serious it is, says the Bible. Proverbs says it too. We're not here yet, but 6:32, the one who commits adultery lacks sense. Whoever does so destroys himself. And so, I'm just the messenger on this one, but the Bible holds no punches when it comes to the cost of immorality in the context of physical intimacy. It just doesn't. It continues this in verse 11. At the end of your life, you'll lament when your physical body has been consumed. Solomon says there will be physical suffering that will come from promiscuity. You can have the obvious that we've already talked about. You can be burdened by the emotional ramifications of these types of relationships, the physical ramifications. In verse 12 and 13, Solomon says, you, the son who's done this, will say, how I hated discipline, how my heart despised correction. I didn't obey my teachers or listen to my instructors. To me, this is simple. This is remorse and guilt. The son who has disregarded his father's advice in this area will get to a point in life where they realize that what they did and the way that people were hurt because of it was wrong. And they'll feel remorse and guilt, and they'll look back at their life and say, I knew better, but I chose the then. I didn't choose forever. So there'll be remorse and guilt. Verse 14, I'm on the verge of complete ruin before the entire community. Here it's public disgrace. And even in our, I'm not going to get on my soapbox about America today, but even in a society that is defined by what society calls openness and kind of do whatever makes you happy with whomever makes you happy, however they make you happy, whenever they make you happy. There is no question that being the person that causes that kind of harm to someone else. So here, the husband who hurts his wife by fleeing the marriage for other physical relationships, or the wife who does the same, that there is a social cost. There is a public disgrace to that. I think it goes back to the prior slide. where Solomon said, you're giving your honor away. I think that's 14 kind of tying it together. And there are a number of examples we could look at in the Bible. We looked at Solomon, but to me, the best example of this verge of complete ruin is King David himself. So the man who killed a bear and a lion, who slayed Goliath, who didn't defeat Saul with military might, but defeated Saul by a servant's humility, who built the palace in Jerusalem, who conquered, who eliminated Jerusalem's enemies, the mightiest men of mightiest men, the Jew of all Jews. In 1 Kings 1, verses 1 through 4, dies this death. Now, King David was old and advanced in age. Although they covered him with bedclothes, he could not get warm. So a servant said to him, let us search for a young woman for my lord the king. She'll attend the king and be his caregiver. She'll lie by your side just so that you can get warm. This was a Near East practice back then. You would find a woman, the idea being that would help jumpstart the circulatory system. So they, King David's courtiers, searched for a beautiful girl throughout the territory of Israel. They found Abishag the Shunammite and brought her to the king. The girl was of unsurpassed beauty. She became the king's caregiver and attended him, but he was not able to consummate that physical relationship the way that they'd hoped. Now you say, Austin, what does this have to do with anything? Well, 1 Kings comes after 2 Samuel. And so I think you have to ask yourself, and we have to ask ourselves, why did King David, the paragon of masculinity and of a servant's humble heart, end up this way, shivering in his bed, impotent and cold? And I would contend the answer is in 2 Kings, when he makes the fatal decision to call Bathsheba to his chambers. And then he compounds that sin with the sin of deception, of assassination. He loses a son. So, go back. I'm on the verge of complete ruin. From the moment that King David had that affair in 2 Kings, I think it's 16, he basically spent the rest of his life on the edge of ruin. He almost lost the kingdom to Absalom. He almost lost the kingdom to Joab. Joab then conspired to prevent Solomon from taking the throne. David had to crawl out of bed to solve that problem. He found himself battered between Bathsheba, who wanted Solomon on the throne, and these other women that wanted their children by him on the throne. Everything in David's life went downhill from the moment that he chose this path. And so he sat on the edge of complete ruin the rest of his life, and it ended this way for mighty King David. So Solomon says, you look at the consequence, and it should make you realize that the long term outweighs the short term. But Solomon is a pragmatic. And so he now gets into the importance of intimacy in the marriage. And he says, first, there is a synergy, there is a coming together in a marriage that outweighs any benefit you could possibly find outside of that marriage. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, water flowing from your own well. So here in verse 15, Solomon says, the wife, the cistern and the well in this analogy, is the sole satisfaction of her husband's godly desire. Solomon does not deny, the Bible does not deny, that the relationship between husband and wife should be characterized by many things, but physical intimacy is one of them. The question that Solomon's trying to answer is, why stick to the marriage and not just go find it wherever you want? Well, 15's the answer, because the God-given desire that a husband has, the wife should be the satisfaction of that. Verse 16's the flip side. Should your springs flow in the street, streams in public squares? That means so too the husband should be the sole satisfaction of his wife's godly desires. Verse 17, they should be for you alone and not for you to share with strangers. So the relationship physically is meant to be between husband and wife. It is meant for them alone. It is not to be shared. And I would argue that means two things. One, it means there's no place, and unfortunately men I think are more guilty of this than women. There's no place for what Trump called locker room talk. That is undermining the dignity and the exclusivity and the precious commodity that is the relationship between husband and wife. And certainly the first part, you alone, means it's supposed to be exclusively inward. It should not be spouses going outside of the marriage. Now, this is a stunning message for our world that does not look at it this way. I think it's a message for those of us that are married. It's a good reminder, certainly. For those of us that have children, it is a good reminder of the burden that we carry as parents to teach our children that the marital relationship is the place where physical desire is to be satisfied. That's how God designed it. That is the place where you can enjoy it without any of the harm that Solomon's described, and that it is the relationship solely between husband and wife. So note the language: water, springs, and streams. He's going to bring all of that now to a conclusion in verse 18. Let your fountain be blessed and take pleasure in the wife of your youth. So remember, this is Solomon talking to his son. This is God talking to his children and saying, let your fountain. We now come to the juxtaposition of all the streams and the waters and the cisterns and the wells. The fountain is the marital bed. If husband and wife will treat with reverence the physical intimacy of the marital relationship, then the marriage will be blessed. And you will be able to take pleasure pleasure in the wife of your youth is just your spouse. And notice there is no verse 19 that says, although her way does not know the path of life and she disregards the truth, because in a marriage, that's not the problem. So you all have heard me say this before. Solomon speaks to the truth that when Eden fell in Genesis chapter 3, we had an intimate personal relationship with God. We lost that. We had dominion that was untainted by pain and sweat and backbreaking labor. We lost that. We had a promise that childbirth would be easy and without cost, and we lost that. We lost the promise of eternal life. But what was it that Adam and Eve were allowed to keep? It is verse 18. It was the fountain of the marital union. They left together. And so that shows you right there how sacred the marital relationship is, and the physical aspect of marriage is part of that. The fulfillment of God's giving, the desire that God gives us for our spouse is to be our spouse, not someone else. And I just want to conclude by kind of dealing with the flip side of all of this. So let's kind of lay the predicate or the foundation. To appreciate what Solomon is saying today, you have to appreciate what God said and what God did in the Garden of Eden. The man said of the woman, this one at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, for she was taken from man. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and bonds with his wife. And that word bonds is dense with meaning. It means emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And they become one flesh. Both the man and his wife were naked, yet felt no shame, which is telling, because they didn't feel any condemnation for the physicality of their nakedness. So that's the predicate. This is how God designed it. In Hebrews 13, verse 4, the author of the book to the Hebrews says it this way: marriage is to be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept undefiled, because God will judge the immoral and adulterers. So God designed it, and then reminds us throughout the Bible, I'm just picking Hebrews, that you are to keep that relationship undefiled by another woman, by another man, by something on the internet, by something on TV. We are to guard and watch against all of that. But we would be amiss to not recognize that it is a struggle, and that temptation is everywhere, and that not everyone has been able to enjoy a life that has not had this problem. So you're someone that says, but I didn't know this when I was growing up. I didn't know this until later in my life. And so I would just remind you and anyone else that there is no sin that's too far. In 1 John 1, John says, if we say we have no sin, we're deceiving ourselves. The truth is not in us if we say we have no sin. I can't judge you. You can't judge me and say I'm better than you, because your sin may be different than mine, but it's still sin. So how do we solve that problem? We confess our sins. And if we do, that will be Christ, is faithful and righteous to forgive our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. So you say, I've made mistakes in this area. I understand. Step number 1, first way you get out of a hole is you stop digging, right? Step number 2, once you've stopped digging, you go to the only place where true forgiveness and restoration can be found, which is the foot of the cross. And we find we can be cleansed from our unrighteousness. And I guess I would lead you then to conclude, I have to always end with something Paul wrote. Paul here is writing for the church at Corinth, and he deals with this very issue. What if I've made choices in my life that have gone away from the way I should? So in the area of physical relationships, what if my past has mistakes? Paul here says, don't you know the unrighteousness will not inherit God's kingdom? Don't be deceived. No immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, males who do this with other males, no thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, swindlers. They will not inherit God's kingdom, says Paul. So if it ended there, that'd be pretty bad, right? Because we'd say, well, but okay, that's not great. But he says, but some of you, who is you? The church. Some of the Christians at Corinth used to be like this. So how is it that Paul can say, you can't inherit the kingdom of God if you've done these things? But then he calls them brothers and sisters in Christ. And the answer is the conclusion, but you were washed, you were sanctified, you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. So the only way to protect and defend a marriage, as all of you that are married know, is with the underpinning of God's grace, and by recognizing that for all the ups and downs and the lefts and the rights and the arguments and the friction that can come, marriage is a beautiful gift that it is designed to do many things. One of them is to honor God with the physical union between a husband and a wife, because truly there's nothing like it. But this is an area that some people struggle. And I would argue really everyone on some level faces this difficulty in their life. So what happens if you have not picked the right way every time with this? But you used to be like this, but not today. Today, you're washed and sanctified and justified. And remember that after justification comes sanctification, which means God forgives us those sins, and then he teaches us how to walk the right path on a going forward basis. And so that is the hope of God's promise.